Welcome to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Table, and I'm here with Mr. Richard Taylor, and we're going to talk a little bit about Elkhorn Creek and some other Kentucky history. Richard, how you doing?
Very well. My interest in Elkhorn Creek stemmed from having moved about a quarter of a mile from it in 1975 on property that belonged to Judge Harry Ennis, who was the first federal judge west of the mountains appointed by President Washington. He acquired about 1,200 acres and lived until the 18 teens. He was the judge who presided over the trial of Aaron Burr.
Oh,
This was not the site of his house, but the best evidence is that about 100 yards from here was Ennis's Station. And Ennis's Station was the site of the last major Indian foray or Native American foray into Franklin County in 1792. And there's this story from the 1870s by his grandson, whose name was Harry Ennis Todd, that there were, at the time of that attack, which was up and down Elkhorn Creek, there were two enslaved persons cutting wood in what is now the front yard of this house. This house was not here. And they were captured, and on the trail, somehow his captors learned that this slave could read. He picked up a piece of paper and read it. And basically, because I guess they were superstitious, they summarily killed him.
oh,
We know this story because the other slave, whose name was Peter, eventually was either traded or escaped and made his way back to Harry Ennis, who freed him, though at that point Peter was getting up in years and simply stayed on with Harry Ennis.
Mm-hmm.
Ennis's house, you could almost see from here. It's about probably 3/4 of a mile. And it is right, it was called Ennis's, that's another name for it. It was also called Ennis's Station.
Yeah.
It's actually the house in which he lived. It was the log house. It burned in 1961. And there a room or two survived, and the person who came next built a house around those two surviving rooms. That home belonged until recently to another judge, a noteworthy Kentucky judge named John Palmore, who was head of the state Kentucky Supreme Court. Anyway, early on, I started kayaking Elkhorn Creek, and I became interested in local history. And over the period of maybe 20, 25 years, I collected information about the Ennis's, about the Indian foray, and then about, most interestingly, about Stedman Town.
Mm-hmm.
And about 2 miles east of here, on Elkhorn Creek, are located the remains of the Stedman Mill complex, which was one of the first industrial sites in the county. And an individual named Ebenezer Stedman and his brother Samuel purchased some defunct mills. There were 3 of them at the site of Stedman Town.
Mm-hmm.
One was a grist mill, one was a lumber mill, but most significantly, the third was a paper mill. And it turned out that Ebenezer Stedman produced most of the state paper used by state government.
Mm-hmm.
And from about the 1830s through the Civil War. The Civil War bankrupted him because he had a big contract with the Confederate States of America to produce paper for money.
Mm-hmm.
He produced the paper. They never produced the payment for that paper. Sadly, his son enlisted in the Confederate Army and was a spy, in fact, rather interestingly,
Mm-hmm.
and was killed before the war ended. Anyway, Stedman Town, there are vestiges of it now on the creek. You kayak the creek, you can see the remains of the chase or the path, the channel through which the water flowed to power the mill, and the foundation of the mill, which was built gigantic blocks of limestone, is still there. On that site, there were dams called crib dams, and in the shelf, the limestone shelf of Elkhorn Creek, there are driven iron rods which penetrated beams which form the crib for this mill, into which debris, rock, lumber, anything was placed in order to dam the creek at that point so they could channel the proper flow of water to power the mills. Also on that creek, having mentioned the 1792 raid or foray, there was a settlement called the Cook Settlement. There's a great story about that. There are 2 cabins on that site now, which survived from 1792. Whether they're the actual cabins in which the Cook lived is another question. There were multiple cabins there, and the Cook brothers in April of 1792 were cutting flax in the field near their cabins when they were attacked by a party of approximately 100 Wyandot Indians. And both brothers were shot fatally. One was mortally wounded, and his wife and his sister-in-law managed to drag him into a cabin. What makes this story so interesting to me is that the 2 women barricaded themselves in this cabin. One was pregnant, and the cabin had just been, it was not quite finished, but it was a substantial enough structure that they were provided some defense. They had a rifle, but no balls for the rifle. They had powder, and one of the women found a piece of lead, unmelted lead, and her adrenaline permitted her to bit the lead, fashioned a bullet. There was a chink in the log, and she shot what she assumed to be one of the leaders of this raid. Fatally shot him, which of course infuriated the attackers, who tried to burn the place, who were there for, we don't know how long they were there, though they knew they could not stay long because the entire area, such as it was alerted, and people were coming to the rescue of these women. They survived the attack, and they've been written up in at least 2 books I've seen of heroic pioneer women of Kentucky. The person they shot was placed in the creek, and his body flowed about 2 miles. And interestingly enough, there is a rock in the creek, this enormous piece of limestone which fell from one of the cliffs above the creek at some point. And it was on that piece of stone that his body lodged. And to this day, it is called Indian Rock. Going further upstream, I should say that we are on what is the main stem of Elkhorn. It begins about 6 miles from here at a place aptly named the Forks of Elkhorn. The Forks of Elkhorn is where the South Fork and the North Fork of Elkhorn Creek converge to form the main stem, which flows, I think, 12 to 16 miles into the Kentucky River. Mm-hmm. Elkhorn is the second largest tributary of the Kentucky River, the largest being the Dix River near Shaker Landing on the Kentucky River. What to tell you? Forks of Elkhorn is an interesting and old community, and I shouldn't tell you this story because I don't know all the facts, or I can't remember all the facts. But during the Mexican War, General Santa Anna was captured by Sam Houston's army and was taken, I guess, to Washington, D.C., but on the way, he came through the Forks of Elkhorn and was thinking, the story was that some people who had lost friends in the war wanted basically to lynch him. Yeah. And somehow he was able to talk his way out of that. Forks of Elkhorn is a very, very interesting little community. The South Fork of the Elkhorn Creek flows into Woodford County and eventually into Fayette County. And when the area was surveyed by Hancock Taylor and by John Floyd in 1773 and then again in 1774, they used Elkhorn Creek as a baseline for their surveys. And the surveys were performed or executed for veterans of the French and Indian War. Let's see. Taylor himself interests me. In fact, I'm writing a piece on him now. He had returned to Kentucky in 1774 as a duly authorized deputy surveyor of Fincastle County, Virginia. And when he was here in 1773, he performed a number of surveys, but they were not validated because he had not been properly authorized. And I think the same may have been true for John Floyd. At any rate, they came back in 1774. They surveyed, Taylor's party surveyed during that summer over 40,000 acres of bluegrass of central Kentucky. They were coming back to join the main party at a point further east on the Kentucky River when a party of Native Americans ambushed them on Elkhorn Creek. And Taylor's cousin, whose name was James Strother, was killed in the first fire. And it was the third person was an individual named Abraham Happenstall, who was a Dutch, originally from New York, and quite an able frontiersman. He took care of Hancock Taylor, who managed to walk for 3 days with a shot in his abdomen and another wound in his, I think, upper shoulder. He managed to survive for 3 days. Before he died, he signed the surveys legalizing, validating the surveys that he had made, which were the first surveys in that area. He died and was buried under a pile of stone, which still exist, much as they were in 1774.
Mm-hmm.
His was the first will executed in Kentucky, although Kentucky at that time was Kentucky County of Virginia. I got really interested in him, and the following year, an individual named, in fact, I recommend to your listeners a book, a journal, which they may or may not have seen, probably not seen, by an Englishman named Nicholas Cresswell, spelled Cresswell. Criswell was in this country on the eve of the Revolution for approximately 3 years, and he commissioned the building of the outfitting of a kayak, not a kayak, but a dugout canoe at Fort Pitt. Most of the journals of the era was very descriptive. I mean, the journal itself probably runs 150 pages or so, and it's quite detailed. In 1775, the year after the killing of Hancock Taylor, his cousin, whose name was Edmund Taylor, and his brother, Edmund's brother, Reuben, who's an ancestor of mine, came up the river with Criswell, and they met their other cousins, Willis Lee, who founded Leestown, Willis and Hancock Lee, at the site of what is now Buffalo Trace Distillery. And their purpose in coming to Kentucky was to see the land that Hancock Taylor had surveyed for Edmund Taylor. And that land was located near Midway, Kentucky. Interestingly, Hancock Taylor, who was entitled to a certain amount of land himself, located his land outside of Midway on what is called the Old Frankfort Pike, and where there is now a structure called Cole's Tavern. Cole's Tavern is interesting because the Cole was the maiden name of Jesse James' mother. Anyway, what interested me was, and I haven't seen this, he located, the choicest property was located near water or a spring. And there is a spring at the site on this property that Hancock had located for, claimed for himself, and heired, incidentally, to Abraham Happenstall. This is sort of disjointed, but I wanted to pick up, and also on this trip was George Rogers Clark, he was also interested in securing land. Went up the Kentucky, this journey after this day sort of detour to Midway, which of course did not exist then. It was simply a buffalo path. The party went on to Harrodsburg to visit Fort Herod, and Criswell writes about going to the fort and seeing that. There's lots of information about lots of sort of personal incidents which he describes,
Mm-hmm.
which makes the journal so interesting.
Yeah.
One of them involves their camping at the mouth of Elkhorn Creek, or actually, I guess it would have been at Leestown, which was the mouth of a creek called Cold Spring Creek.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were camped for the night, and at that point there were at least 3 or 4 other dugouts with them. And that site is important historically because it was a buffalo crossing. It's a natural ford on the Kentucky River, and there were very few of those.
Yeah.
And buffalo would make a kind of circuit down the west side of the Kentucky River, cross at Frankfort, and Frankfort topographically is an enormous coffee cup. Yes. And there is one spot in that coffee cup which, if any of your listeners are interested, is located at the site of the recycling center on Rouse Avenue. And there's a quarry there. And that quarry had a natural, let's call it escape route, that the buffalo used to scale these enormously steep walls of this coffee cup I described. Anyway, the party was camped for the night. In the middle of the night, a herd of buffalo crossed the creek, and one of them jumped apparently into one of the boats where one of the chainmen for this surveying group was sleeping. Nearly killed him, upset a lot of their of goods, and they were the other party was sleeping on shore, and that's escaped that. But details like that are just wonderful, wonderful stories.
Yeah, and a lot of we've said this many times, but those journals of personal experiences are great.
Yeah, and this one has been reprinted. I think it's in something called the American Trail series, but it is an important early Kentucky document. Clark was full of praise for the site of Frankfort. He predicted that a year after his visiting there, it would be thickly settled. He was a little wrong on that, but in fact, he parted from the group in order to make a beeline for Harrodsburg. But eventually the party made it to Harrodsburg. There were a lot of political argument. Nicholas Cresswell, who was about 24 years of age when he came here, was loyal to the King of England. And these tailors, he mentions Edmund in particular. He describes Edmund and his brother as red-hot liberty men. This was right on the eve of the Revolution. You can imagine the quarreling which went on between them. In fact, he said that Edmund threatened to tar and feather him. And so there were some tough feelings. And these guys were working out, it was pretty rigorous, coming upstream on the Kentucky against the current. And the weather was hot, I'm sure, in summer. And tempers were short. Anyway, I traced Reuben. Reuben was 16 or 17 when he came here first. All of these brothers, there were 10 of them. Edmund and Reuben, James, was a Richard. All of them were officers in the Revolution. And about half of them came to Kentucky after the war, as did my Reuben. And we're trying to, I bring him up because day before yesterday, we visited the site, or actually the cabin, that it's a 2-story double-pin log cabin, which still stands outside of Louisville, and we're trying to save it. It belongs to a rather large housing development called Norton Commons. And I think we're going to be able to do that. But that, of course, was important to me. It may not be as much to others. Anyway, but he was buried. Reuben and one of his brothers were buried in the cemetery there, which became the family farm for about 100 years. Getting back to Elkhorn.
Well, what Criswell? Did he go back to England?
Oh, yeah. To finish the story, Criswell went back to England. He took some artifacts, probably some bones, probably some arrowheads, and all of this was simply put in someone's attic. I think he was from Devonshire, or Devonshire, and there, this material, his journal, rested until about 1924, 100 years ago, when one of his descendants found the diary, and it was published. It was published in America, I guess in America too. A New York publisher, I've got a copy of it, published the book, and that itself is crazy. So this was essentially underground for over 100 years. I found that really fascinating. Anyway, I wanted to make a pitch for Criswell. For your listeners, the Journal of Nicholas Cresswell is out there, and it's in paperback, and it can be located.
That sounds like something I need to read myself. Which I know I've heard the name Criswell before. That's a unique. I don't know if I've.
It has the fullest descriptions of any of those early journals I've seen. I'm familiar with Christopher Gist journal. Actually, one or two other persons on that same journey with Criswell kept journals. One was named James Norse, Nourse, and the other, I hesitate to say the name, because it may have been Hanley. At any rate, that's something worth pursuing.
Which, I mean, it sounds like for Elkhorn Creek, hotbed of early Kentucky history.
It was. Well, it was sort of the avenue through which the bluegrass was entered. The North Fork, which I didn't mention, went to John. I remember correctly. John Floyd went on that route and found actually the Royal Spring at what is now Georgetown, and which I understand still provides the water for the Georgetown community, which, as you know, is a large community, given the Toyota factory. But so it's interesting that all of these people converged about 1774. They knew each other. Kentucky was still the domain of Native Americans. There was still plenty of buffalo, plentiful game. I should also mention this Hancock Taylor's father was named Richard Taylor. Brother, was named Richard Taylor. And what's interesting about them is at the time Boone was first coming into Kentucky, these guys came to Kentucky, but they went down the river on a journey of exploration to see lands in the West, and they went all the way to New Orleans. They were gone 2 years, and the brother's name was Richard Taylor. He was the father of President Zachary Taylor. And it's the same Richard Taylor who moved to Jefferson County at the time, actually, that Zachary Taylor was born, which was 1785. And they settled outside of Louisville, near where the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery is. I don't know as much about him, but I thought these guys were incredibly adventurous to make this journey. Gone 2 years. I think I mentioned they came back by sea
Yeah.
to
Wow.
Virginia. And they were looking for land. And there was, among that whole generation,
Mm-hmm.
there was an enormous lust to acquire property, because that's how property was, or that's how wealth was accumulated.
Mm-hmm.
And they were there. Well, not very relevant, but surveying was sort of a family business, surveying and farming, and they had done a lot of that in Virginia. They were from Orange County, Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about land, just the value of land. I recently we had an episode about the Transylvania Company.
Oh yeah.
And Richard Henderson, and
yeah.
Virginia pretty much shut it down. But then they're like, oh, but you can have 120,000 acres out in farther west in Kentucky, and it's okay. Well, I can manage with that.
Right.
So, yeah, that would make you.
One of the largest landowners in Kentucky was George Washington.
Yeah.
Really, George Washington was a member, I think maybe one of the founders of what was called the Ohio Company. And he himself began his career as a surveyor. He was very interested in acquiring wealth, and I think was I read this the other day, one of the wealthiest of the colonial leaders in that revolutionary period.
Yeah. As well. Yeah, but I don't think he never
never set foot in Kentucky.
That
I know. Although I should let me see if I've got this right. I shouldn't mention, because the wife of Harry Innes was related to Washington. In fact, that may be how this appointment came about. Mm-hmm. Though Innes, by all accounts, was an honest and capable judge. Mm-hmm. He was the first federal judge appointed west of the mountain. Mm-hmm. And he was here when, the seat of government was in Danville. He attended the conventions. He also was the personal attorney of James Wilkinson, who founded Frankfort. Mm-hmm. And as you probably know, I shouldn't make pronouncements about Wilkinson, but he was a very ambitious and in some ways manipulative and underhanded figure who was interested less in promoting settlement than he was his own well-being and wealth. And it was, interestingly, Wilkinson who was able to make a deal with the Spanish authorities with an individual named Miro, Esteban Miro, and actually was paid by Miro secretively to work towards the formation of an independent state, mm-hmm. Which would probably be under Spanish control.
Yeah.
And Wilkinson named the streets of Frankfort. He named Ann Street for his wife. Mm-hmm. He named Wilkinson Street for himself. He named some of the other streets after Revolutionary War generals. Mm-hmm. One of whom was General Montgomery, and that street later became Broadway. Mm-hmm. But the street just west of that is called Miro Street. It's the spelling has changed, but Miro Street it's misspelled as Kentucky names sometimes are, but it was named in honor of this person who was essentially operating against the interest of the United States, as was Wilkinson himself.
And now that all does that all fit into the Spanish conspiracy and all that stuff?
Yeah.
Wow, that is interesting. Huh. so much to get into. With it, I mean, this is pretty much, and you mentioned him as well, the foundation or the creation of Frankfort in a sense. You got Elkhorn Creek, you got Leestown, and then steps in Frankfort, basically, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Leestown. You know, it's sad. We were speaking of journals. We know so much about Ebenezer Stedman because in his later life, his daughter, who had immigrated to Texas, asked him about what Elkhorn Creek was like in the early days. And he knew Elkhorn from about the 1820s on. And he wrote a series of letters to her, which became the basis for a book, which U of K, the University Press of Kentucky, published in 1959. It was called, what was it? Bluegrass Craftsman. A local history group here reprinted that, got permission and reprinted that book a few years ago. So it's still very much in print. But in that book, at one point, Stedman said, "Oh, I could tell you everything about Leestown, but why should I? Everybody already knows it." And the fact is, we know very little about the evolution, the rise, and the death of Leestown, or its absorption into Frankfort. There is, well, I won't talk about the Taylor connection there, but you know, eventually it's E.H. Taylor, but one of these brothers, Reuben, I mentioned, had a brother.
Yeah.
And probably the most notable one was a guy named Richard Taylor, called Commodore Richard Taylor. And he had fought in the Revolution. He was, in fact, he was wounded. Well, he eventually died of his wound years and years later. He lived near Westport, Kentucky. Been to his grave. But he was interesting because Governor Shelby hired him to channelize the Kentucky River for commerce. His job in the house he built is on the site of Buffalo Trace Distillery, and it still stands. It has a name even. I think it's called Riverview, and it's not on the tours they give, but it's there, right in the middle of that distilling complex.
It's just right up the road, isn't it?
Yeah, right up the road. But it's interesting that it's either his grandson or great grandson is the distiller E.H. Taylor Jr., who was sort of modernized the whiskey industry and, well, created, I think owned at one time, created 5 or 6 different distilleries, one of which, for those of your listeners who would like to follow the whiskey tour, is on the site of Castle and Key, in fact, which is in Woodford County, in a little community called Millville. And Taylor there built, and it's been renovated now, what appears to be a castle. I mean, it's sort of a fake castle.
Yeah.
Have you been there? Or?
No.
Oh, you need to go there. You need to see the landscaping. All of which he had done. And he was kind of an entrepreneur. He was kind of a salesman type too. And he went bust 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
But he was quite an entrepreneur. Anyway, other questions?
Well, I was going to ask, when was that Taylor? When did he build the castle thing?
Gosh, I know he died in 1923 in quite an advanced age. That was later. He had a relationship with George T. Stagg when he was at Leestown.
Yeah.
And that relationship broke up. and he established a distillery in South Frankfort called Hermitage Distillery, which later went belly up. But at some point, I can't tell you the date, but he bought this complex, or bought this property not far from the Kentucky River at Millville, and built this castle. I don't know the exact date. I would guess sometime between 1870 and 1900.
Well, I just kind of thinking maybe that was the inspiration for the new castle that's now in for sale.
Oh, okay. I don't think so. I don't think there's much connection.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I've never been in the new castle.
Me neither. I mean, we drove by it, and every time I'm like, look, kids, there's a castle.
Yeah.
And it looks cool.
Pretty weird. Yeah. And it is. I think there's a commercial space there. I think somebody sells something there. At one time, I think they had a B&B or a hotel.
Yeah, I think you can stay there. You can have weddings and all that stuff there, but
yeah, an event, center. Yeah.
So yeah, pretty interesting. random thing.
Exactly.
But, anything else about? I mean, specific to Elkhorn Creek. That's a lot.
Elkhorn has become a Elkhorn, which flows toward what is called Peaks. Pardon me. What is it? Elkhorn. I'm blanking on the name. Peaks Mill. Peaks Mill is the site of a livery service which rents canoes and mostly kayaks.
Yeah.
And it is big business now. Elkhorn has been a site during the 19th century, mostly for smallmouth bass fishing. It was regarded as a kind of sportsman's paradise. More recently, I would say in the last 20 or 30 years, it has become a mecca for whitewater kayakers, and mainly from the main stem, putting in at the forks. I do it a lot myself, and going maybe as far as Peaks Mill, or even as far as the mouth of the Kentucky River. But it is a big recreational area, despite the fact that the creek receives a lot of effluence from both Georgetown and Lexington. Waste as well as runoff from farm fertilizing. And the water is no one should be drinking that water. But people are still fishing it, and under the right conditions, it's really a first-rate white water path for outdoor lovers.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you could easily, obviously, spend some recreational time, but just historical spots you could visit.
Yeah, you can see these cabins if you know what you're looking for. I would recommend that you read a book called Elkhorn, which Evolution of a Kentucky Landmark, which has a lot more detail and probably in a couple of cases more accurate than I've shared with you.
Yeah, where can they get that book?
There's a little bookstore downtown called Poor Richard's, and though I'm not directly connected with it anymore, it's one my wife and I started.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Awesome. And well, I mean, you're the author of the book, correct?
Right. Right. It really enhances the experience of being by or near the creek to know something of its history.
Yeah.
And that history, over that, I write about 8 miles of it. And including the Stedmans, William Church, who was another, there was a church cabin off Peaks Mill Road. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. The fact that Harry Innes and his raid occurred there, all of that I find really, really chock full of interesting history.
Yeah. Well, we encourage you to go out there and check out that book. If not, listen to the podcast or come dig up some history yourself.